In 2002, the body of a man identified as Joseph Newton Chandler III was found at his Ohio home 1 week after he died by gunshot wound. When police investigated, they found many of his emergency contacts didn't exist. The man had spent decades living under an assumed name. As it turns out, no one knew who this man really was for over 40 years. Right away, detectives were baffled at the scene before them. It was apparent that our mystery man had offed himself, but why exactly was anyone's guess? The fact that the corpse was discovered only after his neighbors smelled something rotting in the summer heat suggested he was a recluse without many personal relationships. The stench was said to have been so vile that officers had to wear gas masks just to complete their investigation. The man had closed the blinds and turned off the air conditioning before heading into the bathroom where he'd be found. Police officers scouring the sparsely decorated apartment found a handful of possible clues, but the more they investigated, the more questions they had. Joe, as his few acquaintances knew him, had some books on how to make money, an older computer, a handful of self-designed gadgets, and some unremarkable trinkets that he had apparently collected since the 1960s. His keychain had 7 keys on it, 1 for his safe, 1 for his truck, and 5 others of indeterminate origin. Police searched the pickup truck and found an ashtray inside, but as it turns out, the John Doe didn't even smoke. At first, police entertained the notion that the man was a member of the Witness Protection Program, but quickly figured out that wasn't the case. Although he didn't have a will, the John Doe left behind $82,000 in his savings account. It was only after police had great trouble finding a next of kin to claim that money that they realized they had a mystery on their hands. Apparently, a neighbor had once spotted a younger woman visiting him not long before his death and assumed it was his daughter, but her true identity was never established. Since the man was essentially a hermit, the closest thing authorities could find to a friend was an old co-worker of his from Lubrizol Corporation named Mike, who was listed as an emergency contact. Though the men hadn't spoken in months, Mike was appointed as executor of the John Doe's estate. Police determined that their mystery man had secretly stolen the identity of the real Joseph Newton Chandler in 1978 by applying for a social security card in his name while living in Rapid City, South Dakota. This was discovered after investigators tried reaching out to his supposed family members. They soon learned that the real Joseph Chandler had died in a car crash in 1945 at the tender age of 8 while traveling with his parents to visit family for the holidays. Although one detective said this should have been a red flag right off the bat, it should be noted that children were seldom issued social security numbers when the real Joseph Chandler would have been alive. This, of course, would have made it easier for the John Doe to slip into his identity. Another detective involved in the case told the media, quote, "We don't know what or who he was hiding from or who he really was," adding, quote, "This guy made a life out of another life and he made a point to stay unknown." The county coroner concluded that the John Doe had a terminal and quite aggressive case of colon cancer that left him little time to live. The John Doe's body was cremated immediately after the autopsy. Neither the gun nor any of the items in the apartment had fingerprints that could be used to properly ID the deceased, complicating the investigation, which now spanned multiple states. Investigation into who the John Doe was continued over the next year, with police from Rapid City being pulled in to help solve the mystery. It was believed that the man had once served in the United States Navy and had worked as an electrical engineer. Furthermore, investigators had suspected the John Doe was married twice and had been living in California before moving to South Dakota. A detective in Rapid City visited the home where the Social Security card had been sent, but by then the owner had already died. As well, running his name through the credit bureau proved fruitless as nothing showed up until the man landed in Philadelphia. It appeared as though he had been on the run for decades, using fake family members on job applications just as he had on his rental agreement. By 2004, the case was listed on the Doe Network, a volunteer organization that works with law enforcement to help identify missing persons. At this point, Eastlake Police had expanded their search throughout Texas, including the cities of Seagoville, Sherman, and Weatherford. But come November, the case was at a virtual standstill. Despite reaching out to over 50 potential family members, none could identify the John Doe as a relative. An attorney representing the executor of the estate speculated there were sinister reasons for our John Doe going on the lam. Quote, "You've gotta wonder, what terrible thing exactly would you be running from to go to this kind of trouble to conceal your past?" Apparently, the police line set up to help investigators was flooded with less credible theories, such as the man being the alias of the infamous D.B. Cooper or even Jim Morrison from The Doors. His old co-worker Mike told the media how shocked he was at the turn of events, explaining he had never really discussed personal matters with the man he knew as Joe. Regarding the countless theories about his true identity, he said, quote, I certainly wouldn't have gone for the idea of being executor if I had known all of that. And with the case seemingly at a dead end for the time being, a small memorial was organized in autumn 2004. The John Doe's urn was laid to rest at Riverside Cemetery in Painesville Township. In mid-2005, blogger Steve Huff wrote an editorial hypothesizing that the man who called himself Joseph Newton Chandler III could have once been the infamous Zodiac killer who terrorized California in the late 1960s. This kicked off a wave of renewed interest in the mystery, which had until then mostly been obscure aside from speculation on internet forums. Steve Huff's theory was bounced around on other blogs in that time, though of course no definitive connection could ever be made aside from the timeline of the John Doe's disappearance coinciding with the Zodiac killings and other murders that happened in Ohio in the early 1980s. Investigative journalist James Renner penned an expansive article about the Joseph Newton Chandler story in March 2008, the most informative compilation up to that point. Here we learned that the man had worked as an electrical engineer at the Lubrizol chemical plant from 1986 to 1997, designing equipment and doing general maintenance. According to Joe's old coworker Mike, he was known as an eccentric, always seen wearing factory-grade protective glasses, and frequently lied about his age. Apparently he didn't shower much and had a noticeable stink. Most interestingly, the man was known to get up to all sorts of odd tinkering, building himself a white noise machine that fed static sounds through headphones he was always seen with. James also learned that the man hated advertising so much that he built a device that turned his television off during commercial breaks and restarted it once they completed. Sometimes he'd be called upon by acquaintances to fix up their electronics for them, a talent that had become one of his few identifying traits. At one point, he had told a coworker he had something to tell them one day, but never got around to it. Aside from that, there really was little known about his personal life. Curiously, Mike told James Renner that Joe would disappear for months at a time, telling his workmates, quote, "They're getting close." Employees at Lubrizol had assumed he was some kind of paranoid schizophrenic and thought little of this bizarre habit. Aside from work, the only time the John Doe ventured out in public was to get food, usually on holidays like Christmas. Despite Mike's attempts at befriending Joe, he kept a tight lid on his personal life, although he did mention living in Florida and being married to a Cuban woman at one point. Mike continued having him over for dinners, even inviting him to his wife's birthday party once, though the couple sincerely doubted that he'd show up. To everyone's surprise, though, he came to the party dressed up as a Chicago mobster, although he spent the entire night in the corner not talking to anyone. Some of the few photos that exist of our John Doe come from that party. Joe was laid off from Lubrizol in 1997. Mike continued to reach out to him by phone once a year, knowing the man had few friends. Eventually, it was learned that he had been diagnosed with late-stage colon cancer. Though he managed to pay in cash for a surgery, he refused chemotherapy because he didn't want to go on Medicaid. Mike agreed to be Joe's emergency contact after learning he put his apartment manager down as such since he didn't have anyone else. This is what led to him being made the executor of the will. Private investigators hired traced the addresses of the man's supposed family members as they attempted to discern who should get his inheritance, coming upon several dead ends before they found a cousin of the real Joseph Newton Chandler who informed them of her family's fate. This is what initially confirmed that our John Doe was an imposter. Police managed to get a hold of our John Doe's income reporting from every year between 1978 and 2002, with one exception. It seems he hadn't reported any income for 1983. No explanation could be found for this discrepancy. As well, he had lied about working for a company in LA called Wilson Associates between 1975 and 1980. Police tried following up with the firm, but were told that the company had no record of a Joseph Newton Chandler on file. The man's computer had been mistakenly damaged in transportation from his apartment, but prior to that, investigators were able to pull a few clues. For example, his internet history contains searches about plastic explosives along with articles on Nazism. The case went cold, but online detectives were still tantalized by the prospect of finding out who this man really was. Chris Yarbrough of CrimeShadows.com believed that Joseph Newton Chandler could have been an attempted murderer named Stephen Craig Campbell, who was also an electrical engineer. Some of the other parallels included living in similar areas, wearing the same kinds of glasses, and an uncanny physical resemblance. Much like our John Doe, Stephen was also a loner who dabbled in creating his own electronics, including a homemade bomb intended to take out the man his wife was cheating on him with around 1982. Stephen was arrested after his wife found the device ahead of time, costing her part of her hand after it prematurely detonated. Following his arrest, Stephen managed to jump bail and go on the run, never to be found again. There were, however, some facts that poked holes in this theory. For example, their hair texture and height didn't quite match. As a result, investigators were never able to conclusively prove the men were one and the same. Stephen Craig Campbell remains on the FBI's most wanted list as of summer 2024. By 2014, the Joseph Newton Chandler case was in the hands of US Marshal Pete Elliott, who spent 6 months reviewing the facts. Pete believed our John Doe was on the run because he had been a violent fugitive in his previous life, and that he may have had a connection to unsolved crimes. Pete told the media, quote, "This is like chasing a ghost. He lived the perfect life of someone on the run. He had no friends. He never got in trouble. He just lived so very quietly. He knew exactly what he was doing." In particular, he looked at the possibility of the man being connected to crimes from across the United States, including New Hampshire, California, Oklahoma, and of course Ohio. Pete considered the possibility that he had previously escaped from Alcatraz. Despite the man lacking a documented criminal history, the US Marshals found it strange that he was known for keeping a packed suitcase at the ready in his apartment. Pete's profile on the mystery man speculated that he had OCD, and wrote about how the man didn't drink nor smoke. Further details included his habit of listening to white noise, along with several anecdotes about his unusual behavior. One such story was about the time the John Doe drove from Eastlake all the way down to Maine to visit an LL Bean store, only to discover the parking lot was full. Upon seeing this, the man apparently beelined back to Ohio without even setting foot in the outlet. Pete tried contacting former associates of Joseph Newton Chandler, but given the man's reclusive nature, he came up short. That old coworker of his, Mike, insisted they hadn't been friends, but that Joe had stayed for Thanksgiving one year and ate breakfast with his family a few times. Mike had told investigators that the only family Joe had ever talked about was a sister named Mary Wilson, but when officials tried to catch up with her, they only found a vacant apartment at the purported address. Dental records were of no help, as the only matches found belonged to the John Doe after he had assumed the identity of the dead boy he stole it from. A 2014 news article talking about the case caught the interest of James Renner, who shared his own newest findings with internet sleuths on Reddit. James's investigation focused on the man's medical records, which revealed that he had gone to the hospital in 1989 with lacerations to his groin area apparently caused by a vacuum cleaner. More importantly, his attending physicians had noticed that Joe appeared older than he had listed on his medical documents. Furthermore, coroners who examined his corpse wrote that he suffered from male-pattern baldness and was probably wearing a wig in his driver's license photo. These new details excited readers, and very quickly other users jumped in with their own theories. This naturally generated even more curiosity over who exactly this man was, and more importantly, why he disappeared. As interest in the story accelerated, local news outlets in Ohio were back on the hunt to discover the real identity of the man who called himself Joseph Newton Chandler. Authorities left no stone unturned, with WKYC reporting that detectives were investigating leads from as far away as British Columbia and even Australia. The possibility that he was a Nazi war criminal on the run wasn't ruled out either. By a stroke of luck, detectives were able to obtain a degraded DNA sample of the man from the surgery he had done way back in 2000. This led to the first major breakthrough in years come 2016. Pete Elliott sought the services of renowned genealogist Colleen Fitzpatrick after she helped solve a 25-year-old murder case using cutting-edge techniques. In that case, Colleen was able to use Y chromosome DNA information to determine the eventual suspect's paternal last name. Using the same methods, forensic detectives figured out that the man calling himself Joseph Newton Chandler may have had the last name Nicholas, or one very similar to it. Over the next year or two, members of the Reddit community Unresolved Mysteries continued poking around at the story, with some believing it could be tied to another case. There wasn't much to go off of, but investigators were hopeful that crowdsourced information could help tip the scales in their favor. It wouldn't be long before internet detectives would be vindicated, though, thanks to that critical DNA sample uncovered which offered the most promising lead to the John Doe's family. A startling announcement from US Marshal Pete Elliott came on June 20th, 2018. Authorities believed they had finally cracked the Joseph Newton Chandler case and were ready to share the details. The following day, a press conference was organized to reveal the long-awaited identity of the John Doe. His name was Robert Ivan Nichols, and he hailed from New Albany, Indiana. Yet this revelation only brought forth new and uncomfortable questions. It turns out Robert's identity was discovered earlier that March, when a man named Philip Nichols in Ohio was contacted by Colleen Fitzpatrick to do a DNA test. Results confirmed that he was in fact Robert's son, and investigators soon learned that the two hadn't spoken in almost 40 years when the mystery man died. Philip appeared at the press conference to offer some insight into the kind of life his father had lived and why he might have disappeared. It was revealed that Robert Nichols had several brothers, but no sister named Mary Wilson as he had always claimed. Interestingly, the address that he had used for her for all those years turned out to be that of his childhood home, with one distinction. The city the house was located in was his hometown of New Albany, not Columbus as he had always claimed. His son Philip knew of his father's penchant for constructing things, recounting that he had heard that Robert had apparently built himself a machine gun as a teenager. As previously speculated during his years as a John Doe, it was confirmed Robert did a stint in the Navy. During World War II, Robert served aboard the USS Aaron Ward, a destroyer which had been heavily bombed by the Japanese. Injuries sustained from the attack led to him receiving the Purple Heart, with Robert being only one of 4 in his compartment to have survived the kamikaze bombardment. In a harrowing recount to newspapers upon his return, Robert remembered, quote, "I can count 6 times that death stared me in the face." Unsurprisingly, Robert's attitudes towards war had soured after living through it for so many years, and he burned his naval uniform not long after coming home. He never spoke of the war to his children, and in hindsight, Philip believes his father had suffered from PTSD. Robert Nichols had married a woman named Laverne Court in 1947, and the couple went on to have 3 sons, including Philip. Settling into a job at General Electric, Robert was mild-mannered, if not somewhat cold towards his family, and didn't keep many close friends. Eventually, the marriage fell apart as Robert grew more distant to his wife and children, and he applied for divorce in 1964 just as Philip was coming of age. Within a year, he'd up and leave the family on 2 days' notice, first heading for Dearborn, Michigan. Though Robert assured his ex-wife he'd eventually divulge his reasons for leaving, he never did. He occasionally penned letters to his mother and father, once telling them that the phone line at his apartment had been removed and he couldn't necessarily be reached at work. By early 1965, he had told his parents he was headed out west. Robert's letters to his children were less frequent, though more enigmatic. His son Philip didn't appear to hold a grudge, but was still puzzled at why exactly his dad had vanished. Robert's last correspondence with Philip was in 1965, in the form of an envelope he had sent while living in California. Apparently, he had mailed his son a single penny with no letter inside and no return address. He sent one more letter to his parents in 1965, assuring them that he was well and that he'd write as often as he could. It would be the last time anyone in the family heard from him. That same year, Robert's parents reported him as missing. His mother reached out to anyone and everyone she could over the next several months to no avail. Both died without ever learning of their son's eventual fate. US Marshal Pete Elliott stressed to the media that despite uncovering Robert's identity, there were still many pieces missing in the puzzle. What connection he had, if any, to the family of the real Joseph Newton Chandler remains a mystery. As well, there is no indication of what Robert was doing in 1977. 1976 was his last year on record paying taxes under his birth name, and he wouldn't emerge with his new alias until 1978. It is still unclear what he was up to during that time gap or how he made a living. After taking on his new identity, Robert lived in the Cleveland area for 7 years before settling down in his East Lake, Ohio apartment, the very place he'd be found dead 17 years later. To this day, Pete believes it's likely Robert had been involved in some kind of criminal activity, seeing no other explanations for why a man would suddenly disappear from the lives of his loved ones. Though authorities cross-referenced their new information with various cold cases from across California and everywhere else he had lived, they never found a connection. Pete and the US Marshals continued to solicit the help of the public in figuring out what Robert's reasons were for vanishing. For what it's worth, Philip Nichols recounts that his father was never a violent man, but rather that he probably skipped town to avoid paying child support to his divorced wife. In interviews with the media, he speculated that his father may have had Asperger's, which could have also influenced his antisocial behavior. In many ways, this anomaly is a stark reminder that we really don't know what's going on in the lives of those unassuming eccentrics around us, be they neighbors, co-workers, or even close family. And as it stands with the case of Robert Ivan Nichols, we may never know what dark secrets such individuals could harbor.